9 minutes. I push a button.
All attendees are in listen.
To 5 strategies to engage and inspire kids to work harder in school. I'm Bob Sullo, and this is sponsored by Funderstanding, and so a special thanks to Eric Cohen. Now, in our last session in January, I provided an overview of choice theory, and I discussed why giving external rewards for learning is limited in its value, and actually it's counterproductive if we want to foster creative thinking. And I identified our first practice designed to engage and inspire kids, and that's rebooting the brain's natural reward system. In tonight's session, I'll introduce 4 more practices for you to implement as you move from an external to an internal model of teaching. Now, believe it or not, one of the things that we need to do, first of all, is reboot the self-evaluation system. Self-evaluation is a natural process. It occurs non-consciously all the time. We're constantly comparing our perception of what's happening, that's our reality, against what we want at that moment. Let me give you a quick example to illustrate. A classroom teacher, consciously or non-consciously, has a picture of how she wants her class to look. As she scans the room, seeing and hearing something quite different, she immediately self-evaluates and takes steps to get the classroom she perceives to match the picture in her head. But here's an important point. The whole self-evaluation process hinges on what we want. We're motivated to eliminate the gap between what we want and what we perceive. If there's a weak want or no want, there's not enough of a discrepancy or a gap to motivate change. An example will make this clear, I think. A student who doesn't especially care if he does well in school may recognize he's doing poorly, but because there isn't that gap or discrepancy between his want and his perception, there's little motivation to change. And believe it or not, there are lots of students, I think it may even be the majority, who have very little idea of what they want. Now, they know what we want. We tell them all the time. We have our standards and our learning objectives, and they're all clearly posted on the board in the front of the room. But again, that's what we want. To encourage self-evaluation that leads to academic success, it's important that students develop a clear picture of what they want. Now, fortunately, there's a simple and wonderfully efficient process to help students identify what it is that they want. WDEP is a process that was developed by Bob Wobbling. And Bob served as the director of training for the William Glasser Institute for over 20 years. And WDEP is a process that helps students self-evaluate and set goals. Unfortunately, we're having a little bit of a problem with the slideshow here, so I'll do it without it. Now, in WDEP, the W stands for want. It's not enough that adults know what they want for students. To move beyond rewards and punishments and promote an internal motivation to succeed in school, students need to develop compelling wants for themselves, both as students and as young men and women. Without a strong want, there's little motivation and students will flounder. So what's the teacher's role? Well, at the beginning of a unit, you can distribute a WDEP sheet to students with just those key words, want, doing, evaluation, and plan, above blank boxes. I believe in the material that we provided, you have an example of that. You say something like this to the kids, being careful to use language that matches your style and personality, as well as the developmental level of your kids. We're beginning a new unit today. Now, I know what I want for you. I want you all to be successful, to earn a good grade, and most importantly, to learn as much as possible. But this is your education. I'd like you to identify what you want for yourself. On your WDEP sheet, in the want box, write down what you want for yourself as we begin this unit. Now, younger kids can draw a picture of what they want. It's not important that they use words, but even the youngest learners can become more actively engaged in their own learning and education. Now, what you write is for you. You aren't going to turn this into me, so don't try to figure out what I want for you. This is all about what you want for yourself, the kind of learner you want to be. Now, again, younger students in particular may want to share what they want with you. But once students reach adolescence, it's been my experience they're less likely to want to share their want with you. They cherish their autonomy. Now, it doesn't matter to me if I see what the student has written down. What's essential is that I give them an opportunity to be actively involved in goal setting and creating the want that will fuel this internal motivation. In WDEP, the D stands for doing. It's not enough to want something. Having a goal is a necessary first step, but students also need to identify what they need to do to get what they want. Teachers can operate with different verb tenses here. You might use the present tense and say something like, what are you currently doing to have the success you want, or to learn as much as possible? It's also useful to move things into the future by asking students, what kinds of things do you need to do in order to get what you want? By using this future tense orientation, every student has the possibility of success, including those who've had chronic difficulty. I'd say something like this. You've identified what you want, now identify what you need to do to be successful. Write that in the doing box of your WDEP sheet. Now, typically, teachers tell students what they need to do to be successful. Be on time, complete all assignments, bring required materials to class, participate actively in class, and so on. Now, all of these prescriptions are logical. They make very, very good sense. However, when we tell others what to do, we lose the opportunity to engage them and involve them in the decision-making process. By asking students what they need to succeed, we invite them to be active participants in their education, something that fosters internal motivation. Now, once students have identified both what they want and what they're doing or need to do to get it, it's time for them to evaluate the effectiveness of their actions. Again, teachers can use a present tense or a future tense orientation when they get to the evaluation component of WDEP. That's the E. Using a present tense orientation, a teacher might say, are your current behaviors helping you reach your goals? Are you on the road to success? If you want to move it into the future, simply say, do you think if you do the things you've identified in doing that you'll have the success you want? Will those actions get you what you want? Evaluation is the heart and soul of the WDEP process. Teachers typically, not just teachers, all adults, parents as well, evaluate for students with comments like, you'll never succeed if you keep this up, or you're doing a great job, keep it up. Now, while these comments may be accurate, they rob students of the chance to take greater ownership of their learning. External evaluation of students, or it results in students thinking education is something that's done to them. When students self-evaluate, on the other hand, they begin to realize that they are active participants in the education process. So if you value active learning, get your students actively involved in setting goals and evaluating themselves. When asking students to evaluate themselves, I often make it a point to say to them, you don't need to tell me if you're on the road to success at this point or if you're having difficulty. If it's helpful for you and I to talk about it, then let's do it. But what I really want is for you to honestly self-evaluate. I found that when I give students some space and freedom, they're much more likely to actively and honestly self-evaluate instead of simply telling me what they think I want to hear. After students have evaluated their performance, things flow naturally to the final component of the WDEP process, a plan. That's what P stands for. Based on their self-evaluation, students now need to plan to either maintain their success or improve their performance. In addition to making plans before beginning a unit, another ideal time to revisit the WDEP process is in the middle of a unit. If I were addressing the entire class, I may say something like this. You've looked at your WDEP sheets, you've gone to the E, and you've had a chance to evaluate how effectively you're moving towards what you want. Some of you are probably right on course to be successful. Well, good for you. But we're only partway through our unit. What's your plan to make sure you continue to experience success and achieve what you want? Remember, a lot of sports teams are leading at halftime or even after 3 quarters, but the game still isn't all over. So it's important to develop a plan to maintain your success. Now, others of you may not be doing as well as you'd like. If you've evaluated yourself and are unhappy with where you are, well, let me tell you, I have a lot of respect for you. You aren't just burying your head in the sand and denying your problems. You're honestly confronting something unpleasant. The good news for you is that we're not done with our unit yet. You still want what you want. Your job is to figure out what you need to do differently to achieve your goals. And of course, let me know if you want some help from me. The WDEP process, want, doing, evaluate, and plan, when used routinely in a classroom, reboots our natural tendency to self-evaluate. And just as importantly, it helps students develop clarity about what they want. That clarity helps them stay focused and committed, displaying the kind of work ethic and responsibility we want for our students. Now, I want to give you a couple other strategies to reboot this process of self-evaluation. WDEP isn't the only way to do it. Instead of giving kids positive reinforcement when they experience success, have them own that positive behavior by acknowledging their success. You can then affirm what they've done. But make no mistake, even if the difference appears kind of subtle, there's a huge difference between affirming and offering positive reinforcement. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Imagine you're a teacher returning test papers to your students. The traditional positive verbal reinforcement approach sounds something like this. You give Mary her test paper and say, "Mary, you did a great job. I'm so proud of you and the hard work you did. Congratulations." That's pretty standard stuff, right? There's nothing horribly wrong with it. But you have a chance to turn Mary's success into something infinitely more powerful if you approach her a little bit differently. Instead, I'd suggest saying something like this. "Here's your test, Mary." When she looks at it and she sees she's done well, you'll likely see some signal that she's pleased with herself. It could be a smile, it could be a shift in posture, but every kid gives some kind of tell that they're pleased. This is the moment you've been waiting for. At that point, just say, "Hey, what are you thinking?" When Mary tells you she's happy because she did so well on the test, say, "So doing well feels good, huh? Let me ask you a question, Mary. Do you know what you did to have so much success and feel so good? You don't have to tell me what you did. I just want to know if you know what steps you took to feel so good." If Mary indicates that she knows what she did, say, "Well, when we have another test, you already have the blueprint to feel this good again. How's that sound?" Now, on the other hand, if Mary indicates she doesn't know what she did to be successful, something that's not uncommon. I mean, I think a lot of kids haven't made the connection between their success and the behaviors they've chosen. Then say something like, "You told me success feels good, and you like this feeling. Is it worth figuring out exactly what you did so you can have these feelings again?" In both cases, you're helping Mary realize that happiness doesn't just happen to us. It's the product of behaviors we choose, and we're helping all the Marys in our classrooms become more intentional about how they involve themselves in their own education. Rather than just doling out verbal reinforcement or suggestions about what students need to do to improve, we're applying a system that allows students to evaluate their own progress, identify what works and what doesn't, and develop plans to pursue the academic goals that you've invited them to create. The difference is really profound. Now, I want to mention the value of affirmation and to distinguish it from verbal reinforcement. It's important to affirm Mary. As her teacher, as her parent, someone important in her life, Mary values what you say. If she's worked hard and achieved success, it's helpful to acknowledge her and affirm what she's accomplished. Say something like this to her. "You know, Mary, you have every reason to be proud of yourself. I'm very happy for you." But notice the shift from external to internal. Instead of me being proud of you, I invite students to be proud of themselves. And I join in the celebration and affirm their success by telling them how happy I am for them. Now, affirmation isn't just valuable with academic tasks. We can use the same process when it comes to affirming behavioral values we want to promote in our children. When I was a middle school administrator, one of my duties was to supervise about 200 fifth grade students in the cafeteria. Now, every year I could count on the following scene unfolding about 5 or 10 times over the course of the year. A student would approach me and say, "Mr. Sullo, I found this on the floor," as they showed me a dollar bill or sometimes with a 5 or even a 10 or a 20. Now, the typical reward model would suggest that we positively reinforce the student by telling them how proud we are of them and what a wonderful kid they are. And I'm sure you won't be shocked to learn that I didn't do that. Instead, I'd say, very quietly, so no one else could hear our conversation, "Did anybody see you?" Now, the kid would generally look a little bit confused and say, "Oh, no." And I'd quickly say again, so no one else could hear, "Why didn't you just put the money in your pocket?" Now, of course, just like all good lawyers are supposed to know the answer to every question they ask, I was pretty confident I knew the answer to my question. The kid's behavior was already proof that they valued honesty. So the kid would say to me, "Well, that would be like lying." And I say, "Oh, well, you don't want to do that, huh?" And they'd say, "That'd be like stealing." I'd say, "So honesty is important to you?" Now the kid would be looking at me and they're nodding furiously. I'd say, wow, what a day for you. You don't just get to talk about being honest, you get to be honest. What's that feel like? Now notice, I wouldn't say to the student, how does that make you feel? Make you feel is external. Feelings are internal. So at this point, the students typically have a huge grin on their face because they discovered that, you know what, they had a chance to actually live their values, not just talk about them. I then affirm their actions by telling them they had every right to be proud of themselves, and I was happy for them. But I wanted them to own their own behavior and feel proud of themselves because they behaved in concert with their values. See, I don't want kids to behave appropriately because they're looking for an external reward and positive reinforcement. I want kids to behave appropriately because it feels good and is consistent with their own values. Now, the current version of the reward punishment typewriter frequently involves catching kids being good. This approach has pretty much swept our schools about as completely as national standards and high-stakes testing. It's hard to walk into a school today and not witness some adult catching a kid being good and giving them some kind of external reward like a ticket redeemable at the school store. And while it seems benign enough on the surface, there's two huge problems with catching them being good. First, there's a huge number of kids out there who are being good and they're never caught. And a whole lot of them are angry. They're very, very angry. I've heard them say things like this, why should I be good? No one notices. Or how come Deshaun always gets caught being good? I'm as good as him and I don't get anything. This is stupid. Secondly, we're raising a whole generation of kids who believe that the reason we be good is so some adult will catch us and reward us. There's no internalization of values, just kids gaming the system to get a reward. Now, as parents, my wife and I wanted our 3 kids to internalize values. We knew we weren't always going to be right there next to them to catch them being good. And we wanted our 3 children to be good because they wanted to be good people, not because they were getting some external reward. So our son went to college in Minnesota. We live in Massachusetts. He went to Carleton College in Minnesota. And one Saturday morning, Greg called me up and he began the conversation by saying, Dad, I got in a little trouble. What happened, I asked. Well, you know the pond at school? Yeah. Well, you know the dorm near the pond? Yeah. Well, a bunch of us made these awesome slingshots and we were shooting water balloons at one of our friends' windows and, well, we broke a window. At this point, I'm thinking, this could be bad. Someone might have been really badly hurt. So what happened, I said. Well, the 3 guys I was with, they took off. I said, yeah. He said, well, I went to the kid's room to make sure he was okay. Yeah, so what happened? Oh, he was fine. I mean, he had glass all over him and stuff, but he didn't get cut or anything. And then I waited. So I was confused, and I said to my son, waited for what? And he said, well, I figured I should wait for the security guy and give him my name. Dad? I said, yeah. He said, are you angry with me? I said, Greg, I said, this might sound a little strange, but this is one of the best moments of my parenthood. Now it was my son's turn to be a little confused. He said, what? I said, well, not the slingshot and the water balloon thing. That was pretty reckless and, you know, it was potentially dangerous, but everybody does foolish things from time to time. What really pleases me is that you could have taken off just like your friends. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about them. I'm sure they're wonderful kids. But you decided to take responsibility. You deserve to be proud of yourself. And by the way, Greg, not me or his mother, paid for the damages. Taking responsibility isn't as simple as kind of this gratuitous, oh, I'm sorry. When we help kids evaluate their own behavior and build a strong internal sense of self, they grow into responsible adults. Okay. The third practice I want to talk about is to create an inspiring classroom. To bring out the best in your students, it's essential to create a shared vision of what you want. I encourage every teacher to use an activity I created called Creating an Engaging, Inspiring Classroom with their students. Now, the ideal time to do this activity is at the beginning of the school year. But the next best time to do this activity is tomorrow or the next day you're back in class with your students. In other words, do it as soon as you can. I'm going to outline how I introduce this practice with students, but I also want to tell you about an infographic, this wonderful infographic that we created at Funderstanding that you can download for free. If you just visit the Funderstanding website, you'll see it. And with this infographic, there's also an accompanying article that provides a step-by-step guide how to use this activity with your class. And we're currently in the process of trying to get together a poster-size infographic for teachers to get. My goal is to have one of these in every classroom because I think it's visually attractive and really gives a nice idea of how to help kids develop a shared vision with their teacher about the kind of classroom they want. So let me review how we do this process. I would begin by asking the students a very simple question: do they want to have a successful school year? Now, I did this for years with hundreds of students. I never once had a kid say no. Every student, from the most gifted, the most typical, the most challenging, every kid wants a successful school year. I then say, okay, as an adult, as someone who works in the system, as someone who's a parent, let me explain to you what I mean by successful. That means we're working to try to have this be a productive, enjoyable environment. Is that a fair description of success? And again, I never had a kid challenge that or question it or disagree with it. Once the students affirmed that they defined success the same way I did, productive, academically productive, and enjoyable, I would say something like this: since we want the same thing, we have a shared vision for this class, and we really should have a wonderful year. We just need to get more specific. So then I would divide the class into groups of maybe 4 or 5 kids each, and each group would get a piece of chart paper and some markers, and they would create a thing for their inspiring classroom. I draw a circle on the board in the front of the room, and I tell the class, this circle represents what we want: an inspiring classroom where we can enjoy ourselves and be productive. In this circle, we're going to identify those things that we should do and those qualities we should display that will help create the classroom we want. Okay? Now, depending on the age and the ability of the students, you might want to provide some examples like being prepared for class or respect. And I would give the kids about 10 minutes to work in their groups. I don't want to give too many examples, by the way, because the success of this activity requires that students are active participants, not just getting what you feed them. Okay. We'd have each group share what they put in their inspiring classroom circle. Now, expect that you're going to get a lot of repetition. You can see in the example here on the slideshow, honesty, cooperation, and respect happen to be some of the things that this 5th grade classroom did some years ago with me. Those items that are noted by some groups but not others get considered by the whole class, and then the class decides to include it, and it gets added to the circle, and the ones that aren't endorsed by the entire class are left out. Sometimes if you have too many items or you get things that are redundant, like be on time and be prompt, you can combine and cluster items. Okay? Then I would return to the board, and I would draw a rectangle at the base of the circle with lines drawn through it. I'd say, well, we've done a great job identifying the values and the behaviors to create a productive, enjoyable class, and now it's time to look at some of the things that can get in our way. Think of the things that will make it difficult for us to have the classroom we want. Things like making fun of others or cheating. And so again, in your groups, draw a rectangle and identify the things to avoid. Again, I'd give the kids about 5 or 10 minutes to do it. You'll see here, this class had name-calling, laziness, being late to class, being disrespectful. By the way, with some of these words, it's important and worthwhile to have conversation about what that means. You'll notice in the circle above, one of the values that this class had was respect. I'd say, okay, so if respect is something we want in this classroom, what would I hear? What would I not hear if people are being respectful? What would I see? What would I not see? And the same with, some of the negative values that are listed as well. It's important not only that we have a shared picture of what we want, but that we understand each other in the terminology. Too many times over my career, I would have kids behave in a way that was inappropriate, and they would say, in a completely honest way, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. But because they had a different definition of disrespect from what their teacher or other students had, we had a problem. So we want to make sure that we have shared perceptions. Okay. After you've got the circle done and the rectangle done, I would end by saying something like this: okay, I'll get this typed up, copied for us to look at as a group tomorrow. The next day I would distribute an inspiring classroom chart to each kid and say, I've compiled everything we agreed to yesterday. Let's take a few minutes and review what we created. We'd quickly review everything, and then I just ask the kids, if we do the things in the circle and avoid the things in the rectangle, will we have the kind of classroom we want, one where we can be productive and enjoy ourselves. And once the students agree that this is what they want, and their inspiring classroom chart offers them a blueprint for success, end the discussion by saying, okay, we know what we want, we know what we need to do, let's go out and have a great year. Now, before we leave this, I just want to note that use of language is very important. I often use words and phrases like enjoy ourselves and be productive, the kind of classroom we want. Even though it can get a little repetitious, it's helpful for students to connect success and being productive and pairing that being productive with enjoying ourselves. By repeatedly talking about the kind of classroom we want, we're tapping into the internal motivation of our students. We're all internally motivated by what we want, and the artful use of language can help students stay conscious about what it is they want when they're in your classroom. Now, I'd refer to the Inspiring Classroom chart on a regular basis. Have students keep their copy of their chart in their binder, enlarge it, and post it in a prominent place in your classroom so it's something they see every day when they enter the room. Rather than wait until you have a major problem, as soon as you notice students engaging in some unwanted behavior, have them look at their charts and remind themselves of what they really want in your classroom. This will help them stay appropriately focused and prevent minor problems from becoming major distractions. Before we move to our fourth strategy, I want to take a moment to emphasize the importance of positive emotion when moving beyond rewards and punishments and trying to implement a system that fosters internal motivation. As we apply these practices, routinely ask your students how they will feel when they act responsibly, achieve success, and assume ownership of their learning. The more students realize that it feels good, the less you'll backslide and be tempted to downshift to the presentation of external rewards. Okay. The fourth practice is building positive relationships. Now, at first, it seems almost unnecessary to talk about the importance of positive relationships. I mean, it's so self-evident. Most teachers are fairly skilled at building positive relationships with most of their students. But notice what I just said, most of their students. Even in the best schools, there's almost always a small group of students who are doing poorly, academically and behaviorally, often disrupting the learning of others. And it's not uncommon for teachers to complain to me with comments like this. The vast majority of our kids are great kids and they're doing well academically. But we have a small percentage, maybe about 5% of our kids who just aren't motivated. They take up way too much of our time. We spend so much time on this small group that the good kids are losing out. It's frustrating. Now, when I ask teachers about their relationships with these unmotivated kids, the small group that saps their energy and contaminates the learning environment, they look at me with an expression that's kind of suggests bewilderment. How's our relationship with these disruptive, unmotivated kids? Are you serious? It's horrible. What do you expect? If they acted reasonably, I'd have a great relationship with them. But when they act so poorly, of course I have a poor relationship with them. Well, it's in moments like these when I really try to help teachers really connect with the idea that internal control psychology and choice theory is not something we do to other people. It's about how we decide to live our lives. To be blunt, there's really nothing special about a teacher who enjoys a positive relationship with students who are hardworking, compliant, and academically successful. In fact, it would be bizarre not to have a positive relationship with them. But here's the real issue. If you only develop positive relationships who conform to your definition of what students should be, then you're living in the victim box. Okay. Now, too many of us develop conditional relationships, saying things like, well, if they treat me with respect, I'll treat them with respect, or I'll be nice to them if they're nice to me. The problem with conditional relationships like this is they rob us of our autonomy and our power. See, I want to be a respectful person. I want to be a nice person. Conditional relationships paint us into a corner. I only get to be nice and respectful if you're nice and respectful. If you aren't, I'm giving up my capacity to live my life the way I want, a life in concert with my own values and beliefs. When I work with disrespectful, disengaged students, I tell them I'm going to treat them nicely and with respect and do everything I know to build a positive relationship, regardless of how they choose to act. What they choose to do is up to them. What I choose to do is up to me. Now, interestingly, when we decide to treat students with respect, even when they haven't earned it, relationships improve. Maybe not immediately, but even the most challenging kids appreciate being treated with respect. Until we decide to build positive relationships with even the most difficult kids, the ones who haven't earned it, the ones who don't deserve it, things will never get better. We'll continue to be held hostage by a small minority who are disengaged, compromise the learning of others, and erode the joy and the sense of satisfaction that every teacher wants to feel every day. Now, I know it's not easy. Reaching out to challenging kids goes against the grain. Believe me, I know. I remember vividly a particularly ugly incident that took place very early in my teaching career. I was teaching 9th grade English, and we'd been in school for less than 2 weeks. So I'd been a teacher for less than 10 school days. It was a Friday. I was teaching English. I didn't know much about teaching English, but I figured what you're supposed to do is give a spelling test. That's what I was doing, and everything went well with my first period class. My second period class included a lot of high-performing but challenging kids, including Tammy. The students were sitting at tables, and Tammy was at a table with 3 other students. Now, there was room at the table for 6. It was pretty obvious that Tammy was copying from her neighbor. She didn't even try to hide the fact that she was cheating. So I walked closer to Tammy, hoping that my presence would lead her to stop her flagrant cheating. No such luck. So I asked Tammy to move her seat. There was an empty chair next to her. It was a simple request. It was delivered without anger. It was very appropriate. Tammy gave me a look that would best be described as challenging. "Why?" she demanded. I calmly repeated my request, trying not to escalate the situation. That's when Tammy kicked the empty chair, sending it flying, and yelled, "F you," and stormed out of the room. Actually, she didn't say F you. She gave me the unedited version. Now, Tammy got suspended from school for 3 days. When she returned to class, I avoided her. See, that's just common sense. We naturally want to shy away from those who have hurt us, those we don't like. And I certainly didn't like Tammy. I got along well with most of my students, but I had no interest in connecting with Tammy. Tammy and I muddled our way through the remainder of the school year. She was a bright girl who did well academically. But I know she didn't learn as much in my class as she could have. I know I failed to inspire her. Now, if she ever developed a love of English, she was a talented writer. It certainly had nothing to do with me. Knowing what I know now, I'd handle things differently. During that ugly incident with Tammy, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't deserve her profanity-laced lashing out. Where I fell short was when she returned to class 3 days later. I relied on common sense, and I had predictably common results. Part of my role as an educator is to reach out and initiate positive connections, even with the most challenging students. Yeah, even those who don't deserve it, those whose behavior has been completely inappropriate. If I had Tammy as a student today and had that experience, I'd say something like this to her when she returned from suspension. "Tammy, welcome back to class. We had a pretty ugly incident, but we're going to be together for the rest of the school year, and my goals haven't changed. I still want you to be as successful as possible, and to do that, we're going to have to get along. I don't condone what you did, but it's behind us. Let's find a way to work together successfully." So how do you handle these difficult, unlikable kids who take up so much of your time and energy? The best advice I can offer is to internalize and practice internal control psychology. Specifically, ask yourself this question when confronted with unacceptable behavior. If I were the teacher I'd like to be, how would I handle this situation? Remember, anyone can handle students who do what we ask with a smile and a thank you. When confronted by the most challenging students, distinguish yourself by acting with grace rather than settling for just common sense. Second thing is just remember your role. You're an educator. How the students choose to behave doesn't change your mission of education. Your best chance of being successful is to move beyond common sense and build connections with every student. And finally, and this is a tough one, but remember that students are doing the best they can. As unacceptable as their behavior may be, they're ill-equipped to handle it any better, and they're going to remain hopelessly inadequate until they develop more appropriate skills. And who better to teach them how to behave more appropriately than you? That's your job. That's your mission. What we do is so much more than test scores and academic excellence. It's helping kids grow, develop, mature into responsible adults. And in order to do that, we have to have a positive relationship. Don't settle for creating positive connections with most of your students. Take a quantum leap by committing to build a positive relationship with all of your students starting now. Now, in most classes, there are a few students who walk into your room already excited to learn what you want to teach. but those are a minority. So if you're a science teacher, these are the kids who soak up everything scientific. For these students, the personal relationship they have with you doesn't matter as much because they already have a relationship with the content you're teaching. But for the vast majority of students, the following saying is true. They need to know that you care before they care what you know. There's a lot of research that suggests that students learn much more when there's positive relationships in the classroom. Now, as important as it is to build positive relationships with your students, there is a potential danger here. Students may end up working hard only because of their positive relationship with you. Now, while this works in the short term, like a lot of external rewards, my goal as an educator is to help my students discover the joy of learning, not to work hard in order to please me. For that reason, I want them to develop a positive relationship with the material I'm teaching. When I was teaching English, I wanted my students not only to have a positive relationship with me, I wanted them to have a positive relationship with English. Beyond that, I wanted them to develop a positive relationship with learning. Helping students develop a positive relationship with the content you're teaching brings us to the fifth and final practice, making work meaningful by showing how it's relevant to students' lives. We're inundated with information every day. To keep us from drowning in input, our brains automatically sort through incoming information and attend to what's perceived to be relevant while putting less relevant information in the background. What this means to us as educators is we need to find ways to make what we're teaching relevant and meaningful to our students, or it gets screened out by brains that are designed to keep us from being overwhelmed by information. Thankfully, there are specific things we can do to maximize the chances that students will perceive that what we're teaching is relevant. First, building a positive relationship, practice number 4 with students, predisposes the brain to identify the information as worthy of attention. If the students value me positively, they're more likely to say to themselves, if Mr. Solo is saying this, it must be worth paying attention to. The flip side of the coin is equally true. If I have a poor relationship with my students, they're more likely to identify what I have to say as irrelevant. It doesn't matter if what I have to say and teach is profoundly important. It's still more likely to be placed in the irrelevant, no need to tune into this category if we have a poor relationship. This is just one of the many reasons why building that positive relationship with students is essential. Now, making content relevant to kids is especially crucial when you're dealing with adolescents. The primary developmental task of adolescence is identity formation, discovering who we are and want to become. For that reason, adolescents are painfully and appropriately egocentric. They view virtually everything through the following lens. What does this have to do with me? Offer students something that they perceive as disconnected from their experience, and they'll almost always screen it out. Then you'll be forced to drop down to a reward-punishment approach and bribe your students to learn something you believe is inherently valuable, settling for compliance when quality is attainable. But when you create lessons that students connect with, you'll have a much more engaged classroom. Now, before we discuss the topic of relevance in detail, I want to acknowledge that there are some teachers who believe creating relevant lessons that kids connect with is somehow coddling them. More than one teacher has challenged me when I do workshops by asking, shouldn't they just do it because I tell them to? Well, several thoughts come to mind when I hear this kind of question. The first is, maybe they should do it simply because you've directed them to do it. But the better question seems to me, are you satisfied with how many students are fully engaged and how much they're learning? Would you and they both be better served, and would you get more of what you wanted if you offered lessons that the kids found meaningful and relevant? Instead of constantly harping on what kids should do, ask yourself if kids would learn more when they perceive the material as relevant and take some effective action now. Second, I find that whole question, shouldn't they just do it because I tell them to, wonderfully ironic. As someone who does staff development, when I offer sessions to teachers, they routinely say to me, give us something we can use. If you don't give us something meaningful, we're not listening. Now, teachers just as teachers rightly want to know how they can use information and why it matters to them, students want and deserve the same thing from us as educators. Learners, regardless of their age, need to perceive the information as relevant and useful if we hope to maximize learning. Refusing to help your students appreciate the relevance of what you're teaching is, quite bluntly, unprofessional. And finally, I think a number of teachers who ask, why is it important to help kids see the relevance of what I'm teaching, are really just paralyzed by fear. These teachers are afraid that they can't demonstrate the relevance of what they teach, so they hide behind this false notion that relevance isn't important. But let me assure you that relevance is essential, and the fear is not at all uncommon. The problem exists, I think, because a lot of people define relevant in a very narrow way. As something that's very, very immediately and directly applicable. Now, a lot of us teach content that's not immediately or directly applicable. For example, a lot of high school math and science teachers tell me the majority of my students will never use what they're learning in my class. How can I make this relevant when most of them will never use it again in their lives, and they'll go on to be successful in college and beyond? Now, well, I'll agree that the content you're teaching may never be specifically utilized by your students in the future. I mean, no one has asked me to define a cosine or a secant in the last 40 years. The process that you're teaching is important and relevant. The last science class I ever took was chemistry, my junior year in high school. And I still have very fond memories of our chemistry teacher telling us at the beginning of the year that he was more interested in teaching us a way to think than whatever specific content we covered. And an appreciation of the scientific method and the way of solving problems has served me well, even though I never studied science again. Okay. So don't just limit yourself to defining relevant as something that's directly applied. It's much bigger than that. One of my favorite quotations is from a theatrical adaptation of the novel The Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. A flower is useful because it adds beauty to the earth. Relevance doesn't belong exclusively to those who teach us how to balance our checkbooks. Think about what you teach. Develop clarity about why it's beautiful and communicate its relevance to your students. When you begin to expand your definition of relevant, you'll no longer be afraid that you can't communicate to your students why what you teach is so important. I also encourage teachers to challenge their students to discover the relevance of what you're studying. By involving the students in this process, you're creating a collaborative experience and sharing the burden. An easy way to help students discover the relevance of what you're teaching is to ask them some of these simple questions. Why do you think we're asked to study this? How does this have any impact on us today? Why did some group decide that this was worth our time and energy? In other words, share the responsibility of uncovering the relevance with your students. When you ask your students these kinds of questions, you're engaging them. Their curiosity is piqued. And as they confront why some things are deemed to be worthy of study and others aren't, they begin to appreciate the relevance of what you're teaching. Sometimes it'll be the content, sometimes it'll be the process. Either way, the students will learn more when they personally connect with the material. Okay, at this point, let me share a few examples of how you can create relevant, meaningful learning experience with your students. I'm from Massachusetts, and I worked in Plymouth, Massachusetts for 33 years in the public school system. The state proficiency exam in Massachusetts is called the MCAS, M-C-A-S, and it's administered every spring. The math test for sixth grade students includes questions designed to determine if kids understand and can apply the concepts of mean, median, mode, and range. Now, typical sixth grade students don't walk into a classroom enthused about mastering mean, median, mode, and range. But I had the pleasure of working with one math teacher who found a way to get her students excited to practice, learn, and apply these concepts. Here's how she did it. Because we're in Plymouth, the teacher and the students were both fans of the New England Patriots. Now, since school starts in late August or early September, the Patriots would have played several preseason games by the time school started. The teacher would put the score of each game on the whiteboard at the back of the room. Now, it didn't matter if the Patriots had won or lost. The goal wasn't to talk about football, something the students would have been quite happy to do. The goal was to use the scores as the data set for the students to practice identifying mean, median, mode, and range. Each week, a new game got played, a new set of scores was added, giving the students more data and practice. The day after a Patriots game, when the students entered the room, they were asked to add the new scores to the data set, recalculate mean, median, mode, and range. Now, this is a true story. I actually heard students saying things like this as they entered the classroom the day after a Patriots game. Hey, the Patriots scored 35 points yesterday. I wonder what that'll do to the mean. I mean, it was pretty exciting to have 6th grade kids talking mathematical jargon, using it appropriately, and being excited. I had one student tell me, somewhat sheepishly, I actually look forward to getting new scores and figuring this out. It's pretty cool. Now, whereas some students have their students practice these essential skills in a way that's pretty tedious and disconnected, this teacher used a simple strategy to turn something that could be drudgery into something the students perceived as interesting, relevant, and meaningful. And this is the most important part. Her students traditionally earned the highest scores in our school when the MCAS was given. It's not just about making relevant lessons so the kids will enjoy it. It's about helping kids learn more, achieve more. Creating relevant lessons isn't done just to make the classroom fun. It's not done to coddle kids. It's done because it supports academic achievement and it activates the desire to learn. I know from my experience as an English teacher that a lot of students don't enjoy writing. Even those who do, a lot of times fail to see the importance of accurate spelling, correct syntax, grammatical accuracy. Last year I was doing some work for a high school, consulting with them on, I was there several times. And I was in this high school's humanities class where the students were studying both English and social studies. The students had been studying the American colonies, and the writing assignments they were working on when I observed the class was designed to engage them by making it matter. The students were divided into teams, and their task was to create a brochure to encourage British citizens to leave England and to move to one of the colonies. Each team had a different colony to sell to their audience. Their brochure had to include information from their study in history, natural resources, employment opportunities, religious freedoms, geographical features, all of those things. Because the students knew their success would be based on how well they expressed themselves, I watched these kids vigorously debate what were the most important features to include in their brochure. And just as importantly, they were careful about the word choice, the spelling, the punctuation, and all the other components that make for effective, persuasive writing. Both the teacher and I were convinced that the quality of their writing and the learning they did was significantly deeper because they were engaged and found the task meaningful. That teacher took something that happened 250 years ago and made it come alive for 21st century students. One more story. I read about an 8th grade math teacher in Texas who has her students design a golf course. The students work on this project one day a week, and they need to research land costs. They have to practice skills related to computation and percentages, as well as linear and quadratic functions. And the students are required to develop a business proposal, create a 3D model of their golf course, tape a commercial, and present their project at a mock trade show. The students are engaged and enthusiastic about learning and applying math. And this is what the teacher, Trudy Pazinski, has to say about the experience. It really comes down to showing the kids how they can take what they learn in class and apply it to the real world. Anytime you can make learning fun, it's a good thing. Teachers have a lot on their plates. With so much to teach, especially in the current environment of accountability and national standards, it's easy to forget to highlight relevance. It's easy to downshift to, you have to learn this because it's on the test, and you have to pass the test because we need to make AYP, etc., etc. Please don't settle for that. Make yourself a promise. As you prepare to teach every unit, ask yourself these questions. Why am I teaching this? How will knowing this help my students? How can I help the students relate to this material? And don't forget to involve the kids and ask them to discover the importance and relevance of what you're teaching. By staying focused, conscious, and intentional, you and your students will find that what you're studying is relevant, meaningful, and worth your concerted effort. To wrap things up, it's time to give up the whole motivation myth. Despite the continued dominance of the reward-punishment model, there's now decades of research that suggests that when we're talking about the highest levels of motivation, we're driven from within. Those who cling to an outdated system of understanding human behavior do their best to motivate kids with the threat of punishment and the promise of external rewards. But that's a system with a built-in ceiling. Rewards have taken us as far as they can. They're like the best electric typewriter we can imagine. Pretty good, but it's time for something completely different. Despite their positive intent, rewards do a lot of damage, including eroding creativity and diminishing productivity. The good news is we no longer have to rely on a system based on external control. We can begin to embrace a new system, one based upon and congruent with internal control psychology, by implementing the 5 principles that we've talked about. Okay. First, number 1, reboot and take full advantage of the brain's natural ability to provide powerful internal rewards whenever we learn something new. Remember, we don't need positive external rewards when we have internal rewards. Number 2, reboot our natural ability to self-evaluate. When students evaluate their own performance, they develop responsibility, they take appropriate ownership of their learning. 3, create a shared vision with your students about what it is you want. Since people are motivated by what they want at that moment, be certain that you and your students are motivated to achieve the same thing during your time together. Your time together is too precious to squander. Build that shared vision. 4, create positive relationships with your kids. Just as importantly, help those kids develop a positive relationship with what you teach and with the process of learning. And 5, create learning opportunities that your students find relevant and meaningful. The more students connect with what you're trying to teach, the more you'll activate their innate desire to learn. So when do you start? Right now. There's no need to wait. You can implement the practices I've suggested with no additional training, no specialized training. Well, I would certainly encourage each of you to become well acquainted with internal control psychology, specifically with choice theory. You have everything you need now to move beyond the motivation myth and create joyful classrooms characterized by high achievement and the motivation to learn. I wish everyone who's been listening to this success in your quest to help us raise the next generation to be happy, healthy, and responsible decision makers with a strong internal compass to guide them. Thanks very much for listening.